Hello, folks. It is Mike Levin on January 22nd, 2022. And it is a Saturday morning. And I'm picking up the kid. And I got so much to talk about, so much whirling around in my head. And the drive's maybe a quarter of the way over, so I better get started or else this thing will be done and I won't want to shoot a video in the return drive where I'll be talking with my kid. It's a good hour and a half stretch that I have, just one-on-one, where there are the electronics, so that is always a thing in this day and age. You couldn't really, well, you could. Perhaps I do not have the parenting skills to take away electronics on a car drive and say, just talk. It's kind of the equivalent of gathering around at the dinner table for a meal with no phones at the table. Does anybody do that anymore? Back in my day, it would be no books at the table, right? So things of great redeeming quality frequently get vilified because the generation before it wasn't their thing. So, you know, the world is going into disarray. The world's going to hell in a handbasket because printing and literacy and those people who buried their nose in books were spending their time in some intellectual cerebral place and were not being productive with all the stuff in your real world. Now today, of course, we would view reading as a much more highly valued activity and not as a corrupting influence. But then radio comes along. Radio is a new corrupting influence. There's stories, there's serials, they carry you along from episode to episode, and of course comic books were vilified before that because while it was reading, it had pictures and it dealt with diverse subject matter that classical writing didn't always have in a palatable form for the young. So the young are drawn to the new medias. They're easier to consume. The barrier to entry on the literacy front is lower for consuming because once you learn how to speak, you then know how to listen to and watch and consume media. So one is media literate, at least on the consumption front, before one is reading and writing literate. And that's kind of an important point because reading and writing literate takes a fair amount of work to make it accessible and natural and to come to you without thinking. You don't think, how do I read while you're reading? But that is a hump that you get over while you learn to read, and it's a much more difficult hump than maybe many people in their adult lives remember. Same with riding a bicycle. In fact, lifting your head up was one of the first. Opening your eyes came even before that. And these are monumental challenges when you're in the moment and facing them as a newborn infant, and then as a baby learning to crawl, and then as a toddler learning to walk, and then as an adolescent learning to think. And that's such an important age. I always keep bringing that up, and that is, there's different words for it, but the one recurring theme that keeps recurring is Dorothy and Alice. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, of course, and Dorothy, Gale from The Wizard of Oz. And these are two stories that were made for the consumption by young children, large proportion of girls, because the protagonist is a young female in both instances, and then the reality of the and perhaps even the validity of the story is called into question at the end as all a dream in both cases. More so with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland than with Dorothy, because spoiler alert, Wizard of Oz books, it's not a dream. Dorothy keeps going back, and all the detailed rules concerning Oz and its nature and why it's not seen, and the misdirection that's used to keep it from being seen from, say, pilots and airplanes, because at around the time the books were coming out, air travel was becoming more popular, so Frank Baum had to answer these questions, and he was very responsive to his readers. He was interactive with his readers, and when they expressed something, and especially when enough people expressed something and it's a good idea, he would write it. So these, I think, 14 books of The Wizard of Oz are really a quite spectacular journey and adventure through the inventiveness, the original inventiveness, and quite, frankly, violence, frankly Baum violence of the first book, which is completely downplayed in the movie. Sets a tone which softens a lot. The whole, are people culpable for their actions, and let's punish them, tone of, revenge, say, against the wizard for what he did to Oz, were very much downplayed, and people were given second chances and third chances, and real redemption was achieved for various characters. And social mores and norms are challenged the whole way. Gender questions are brought up. We think it's such a new thing, but Ozma of Oz, research it. It's been around for a while. And perhaps even, unreasonable expectations of the way of quite how magical today's world can and should be, based on the expectations of fantasy and fiction that dates pretty far back. So there's that. It's more relevant today. It's as relevant today as it's ever been. The books of Dorothy and Oz. And it deals with APIs. It's really interesting how the lessons of life, of interaction, because everything is APIs. I think I touched on this in a prior video. Lessons of life get layered on, and they're not always properly received lessons at first, and sometimes they need to be altered and modified and changed on the fly. It's really a strange and interesting thing, but finding the secret entrance to a land of Oz that is distant and separated from the main lands of Oz, far enough, perhaps in the wilds of Quadlingville or something, it's reasonable to think there's places that are difficult to access, but where plenty of life is going on. There's activity there. Things are happening that are of interest to the Princess of Oz, Ozma at this time, who can see that these are going on because she has a book that writes down all the happenings. Maybe it's not Ozma. No, Ozma has the mirror where she can see anywhere. It's like the crystal ball, but not broken. The witch is the Wicked Witch of the East, West, I forget. Her crystal ball in the movie, it was actually broken and only let her see one thing per day. It only worked once per day. But Ozma has a mirror that lets her see in on anything in the whole world, inside or outside Oz. So that's a very powerful power. But she has to be watching when it happens. Glinda, on the other hand, one of the witches, the good witch, is in the north. So she has a book that's writing everything down that's happening of Oz as it happens. Now, this is, of course, unreasonable because it would have to be a copy of the entire, Oz right there in the book, because to have the resolution to record everything is, 100% initial conditions or ongoing observation that doesn't interfere here, so it's outside the system. There's all kinds of nuanced issues going on here as to why it's not reasonable, but all these things are explained very acceptably, not, watertight. There's all kinds of inconsistencies in the evolution of Oz. Speaking of which, Toto can speak, because all animals in Oz can talk, and Toto not talking in the movie and in the early books is a matter of Toto not wanting to. So I told you, spoiler alert, so if this is ruining stuff for you, you're bad for not tuning out then. Okay, so people learn and they layer on experiences. And as the book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the first of the two books, the second being Through the Looking Glass, which the Disney movie kind of blends and muddles the two together. But honestly, Disney did a very good job of bringing greater organization and sense to a muddled mix of, disjointed, incoherent experiences. The transitions are very strange and abrupt in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and Disney smooths it out, and they add a touch to the Walrus and Carpenter poem that I highly approve of, which is the walrus after eating the oysters. Spoiler. The carpenter didn't get his share, whereas in the poem he goes, cut me another slice. I wish I did not have to ask you something. I had to ask you twice. I forget the exact line, but it really implies the carpenter got some oysters with pepper and vinegar too. It's very nice indeed. And so the carpenter got his shares of the spoils, their shares. I'll try and stay gender neutral. I guess I approve of the ability to choose your pronouns, but I disapprove of pushing people around about how they should live their lives. Agendas really are terrible. You only need one agenda in your life. It's the agenda you set in your own head because you're a confident person, because you've embraced an objective reality at an early enough age where you can play the observation game, narrate your life in your head, and mitigate nonsense. Stop the ridiculousness. Don't let groupthink drive you in certain directions. It's going to happen. It happens to everybody. I've been swept up in groupthink from time to time, and then everybody in a reactionary mode against that tries to be different and special, and everyone wants to feel different and special and unique in this world. And everyone really is, because DNA, even identical twins, there's going to be drift as your cells double and double again after conception in a process called bifurcation, times 2 times 2 times 2, gets things really big really quick. So just a quick point about scale. I'm not sure if I have this exactly right, but E equals mc squared. So matter is light, is energy. Energy is light. Light is just another word for energy. So we are pure energy beings. We are the same pure energy beings of Star Trek that are, constantly speculated at. It's just our energy is condensed. The energy particles have been brought at some point close enough together that forces override each other, forces that have different effects at different distances. So, gravity is a weak force, but it works over a long distance, and, all the other forces that we've sort of unified, the strong and weak force inside the center of an atom that holds the protons and neutrons together and keeps the electrons in orbit, those are all extremely strong, but they are that strong at short distances. And so these, different distanced forces results in things being able to clump together and matter being formed, and things being able to go in orbit around each other. So for things to stay in each other's proximity, but not actually occupy the same space when they are clumped together, right? So there's a few other things that go on, like what happens when electrons enter and leave atoms, energy states go up and get reduced. What happens when photons enter and leave electrons, which excite the electrons to higher energy states or allow them to relax and come back down to their more natural low energy position. And the giving off of heat, but where I say we are all light, heat is just another word for light or energy. So you'll hear a lot about thermodynamics resisting unification like gravity does. So, the standard model, boring name for a spectacular combining of the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, but not gravity, and not necessarily information in thermodynamics either. So whenever people say, oh, it's only gravity resisting unification, no, there's also things about friction and heat dissipation that resist unification as well, because of quantum effects, friction is inherent in everything. Friction causes heat to escape always on every interaction, for the most part. Bob Lazar talks about energy sources for gravity generators that don't do that emit no heat. So when you point the cameras that see heat, because cameras see electromagnetic, so you can dial it to heat, you can dial it to light, you can dial it to other energies, infrared, ultraviolet, of course, and up and down the electromagnetic spectrum. That's why radio telescopes are so cool, and other kinds of telescopes are so cool. It doesn't have to be the visual spectrum. There's more interesting stuff going on up and down those spectrums, but because the way life works, our visual systems have keyed on to a little slice of it that has a lot of useful information. It's Occam's razor at work. We are not evolved to see the whole electromagnetic spectrum because it would overwhelm us. We're not mantis shrimp, and they can only see 12 colors, not even that much more, just a bit up and down the infrared and ultraviolet. So colors are an invented thing by our brains. It is not an objective experience. It is a collectively agreed upon human experience that differs with other species. Other life templates have different colors. So that means the color wheel is a lie. There are not complementary opposite colors except as in reference to the human condition, and then not even for all humans because color blindness. So, is a strawberry really red? So who's to say a strawberry is actually not blue in some other people's experience, and your words for blue and red are just switched? So we cannot know. We cannot know. The world, in many of the ways we think the objective world exists, it's because of agreed upon standards of human beings living in a local environment where you can go, okay, even though really we know that because of the law of induction, the problem of induction, the induction dilemma, you can't know anything is objectively true because it's coming in through your senses. And your senses can lie to you. Your eyes can lie to you. Your ears can lie to you. Your nose, your sense of touch, your equilibrium, your sense of direction, all of that can lie to you. So, you don't really know that what you're experiencing is an objective truth. So, like in law, it is a preponderance of evidence that you require in order to accept objective truth. And that is generally science and the scientific method, because observation, prediction, experiment, reproducibility, right? So it even brings in the professional world. I'm on JupyterLab, which is a evolution of Jupyter Notebook, which is an evolution of attempts to make scientific research reproducible. MATLAB, Mathematica. There's a heritage of these notebook systems in academia, mostly, you see. And they have expensive licenses, $500 students, 1,000 or 1,500 once you go into industry. And even Anaconda, the free and open source bundling of all the data scientist tools today, now has a license that if you use it for commercial use, it's a no-no. So I got to look into the license for JupyterLab standalone, but like the reason 9 out of 10 people install Anaconda is to get JupyterLab, and JupyterLab is now installable standalone, so you don't need Anaconda. It's big news. It's been ported to an Electron app. And so, so how do we tie this back to that whole big philosophical thing I'm going on to and experience? Well, there's a tools connection here. There's a language and tools connection, and a network node, a neural node discussion. What is the nature of life? Well, probably most of the channeling. So the channeling of the nature of life, the real philosophy of our modern times, in a consumable way, because the real, academic philosophy field out there is references to references to references, and proving your idea is unique and that you created something in the new sphere, because no idea is new, so you can't go making claims if you didn't fully vet it against, all prior body. So I hate modern academic philosophy. It's just as bad as like being a scientist these days. I think I dodged a bullet in getting drawn into SEO. Graphic design, then SEO. That was my path. Graphic design, webmastering. I was a webmaster for a while, then SEO. And this played out through before the web, before the rise of the web. So the internet existed. I was on the internet by way of Commodore Computer's VAX system. So I had a CBM VAX account. So I was Michael at cbmvax.com or whatever it was to log in. And so I got on the old school Usenet and IRC. So I was in chat. I didn't like chat quite as much. I loved the news groups. And Alt-Sys Amiga, I guess I hung out on. I was involved in an attempt to overthrow the Commodore board of directors and instill new people and save the platform I loved. I really fell in love with the Amiga computer. And so the discussion keeps coming back to language and tools. One, in order to have a good way of experiencing the universe, takes up language and tools and language. It's a intertwined mix, and other things like martial arts and martial arts weapons and sports and athletic equipment and driving and anything muscle memory with standard equipment so that you can make assumptions when switching around tools and environments. There's a common thread here that ties into what humans do well. And a topic I'd really like to take my videos to, that I've sort of been building towards, is that there's different types of people. There are different types of people. Different natural predilections to certain activities. Some people are naturally predisposed to being multilingual in a spoken sense. I am not one of them. I am not good at multiple spoken languages. I've made attempts, the high school attempts, because you're forced to take 4 languages. So I went through that, and a few basic things have stuck so that I can understand a few Spanish words here and there when spoken. It sometimes deeply surprises people. But it's never interested in me enough to take it up, except perhaps in the form to learn a little more Hebrew, to read the Torah, the 5 books of Moses in its original form. That's been a temptation to learn another spoken written language. Another temptation has been Japanese, when it seemed like the Japanese were taking over the world during the 90s, when everything was built by Japan. I was like, let me learn how to ask for some coffee, please. Kohi kudasai. And for a while I was living in Inwood, there was so much Spanish spoken around us because of the Dominican population. So I had some interest there. But it never really stuck, and I never was able to go full multilingual, a lack of immersion possibly. But where I did have the need is technology. I have always seen the value of expressing myself through automating things, automating systems. I was a Radio Shack X10 customer for two rounds of X10 I did in my early childhood, and then again in maybe my 20s. Before the web, while there was internet, I was on the internet, but I didn't do much internet interactivity with these types of things, but I was doing Amiga script-driven automation, turning on and off lights and things. So I totally got this out of my system. And today's round of smart house, smart home, not of interest to me. The stuff with the Alexa and Google devices spying on you, a little, and Siri for that matter, a little bit of concern to me. Always on, the features of the Infinity transmitters that I was once aware of and not paranoid about, but impressed that they existed. So someone was telling me, oh, they can pop the camera on any web, cam on and observe you. And I'm listening to this going, you know what? Back in the 60s and 70s, there were Infinity transmitters. It might have taken a visit to your house, but they could install some hardware in any telephone where they could click your telephone mics open and listen. Your own phones became the bugs to listen to you in your house. It's called an Infinity transmitter. Strange name for a simple device that just does with microphones and speakers what they're designed to do. Every speaker is a microphone, so if there's a speaker somewhere, they can listen to you through that. And these technologies have been used. It's just part of Spook 101. So you probably ought to know about that. And it goes back to the 60s and 70s, probably longer, but as long as there's been not even digital electronics, but electronics at all, there's been spying. And so, when I hear this stuff about the webcams, I'm just like, oh, of course, it's just become easier. But expectations of privacy have lowered so much because of the benefits we get from these miraculous Wizard of Oz-like devices in our life. And then there's going to be robots a la Asimov. I'm watching Asimov on Apple TV on my Android-embedded Linux smart TV, which is a Best Buy brand, probably bought from a generic factory in China. So there's so much going on there, from the electronics to the economies of scale to the branding to the product of different ecosystems flowing between each other. Apple TV playing on an Android device. I thought I'd never see the day. That was a when hell freezes over kind of situation, as was, when will Google Docs work offline? I don't know when hell freezes over. But, lo and behold, things get chipped away systematically because APIs improve. And that brings this whole thing full circle, almost full circle. I'll try and remember what I was talking about when my thoughts went to APIs, the interaction of things, the friction between things, that the world is really all just application program interfaces, with the main one being the world, the interaction of electron fields is really a big deal. Yeah, someone almost did the a-hole maneuver on me, but then realized what they were doing and let me merge. People speeding up when they see you changing lanes is really an evil thing, there is a quality of people thing. When you see that kind of stuff, that person is a qualitatively lower person than another human being that would not put you in an awful situation. So the person I just encountered realized what they were doing and stopped accelerating and let me in, because I was going to make my way in. I guess being in a red Jeep, there's like red armor. You project a certain thing. It's like, oh, am I going to cut off a red Jeep with New York plates? No. I don't think that's a wise idea. But they would cut off some smaller vehicle in a heartbeat. But nonetheless, that's yet another sub-discussion there. So many things. The world is built up of APIs. One of the important APIs is the interaction of fields. How fields interact. That fields are a thing. And the fact that fields are a thing, that means that there is a way for field-like energy to propagate through a medium or a substrate. That means things are connected even at vast distances. And that means that everything is all probably part of one single whole or one thing, and that the whole Gaia, we are one thing. And, monotheism, for that matter, have it right. What God is, what the universe is, it's just a matter of stupid labels that get tripped up on language, which are an imperfect tool to make, compromised approximations of reality. To process reality, to make observations, one must have language to record those observations. That language has deep, deep biases based on how it evolved. All the gender stuff that's in spoken languages would be a prime example of that. But it goes now deeper now that we're talking to machines. Now that we talk in languages like C and Python and Lisp to machines to have them carry out our instructions. These languages are precise. You don't work in fuzzy terms when you're flipping bits in silicon glass. The things our bodies chose to not use for bones, thank goodness. Our bodies chose to extrude calcium, rusted metal. Rusty foamy metal is what we're built out of, clamshells and teeth, and most rigid things in animals are built from some variety of the metal called calcium, the soft silvery metal that we think of as a white powder because of how it interacts with oxygen and rusts. So limestone, it's all, so much stuff about life is concentrated rusted metal that's left over. One of the more common items in our bodies, but less common items in nature than, say, silicon. Silicon is much more abundant in nature. Glass, sand. That's what we build computers out of. And it's a rigid material that could have been scavenged from our early, one-cell ancestors to make rigid parts, spinal cords and stuff, or the vertebrae, the backbone protecting the spinal cord. That probably came early on because of the preciousness of that one single cell, a nerve cell that had to run a really long distance to become your spinal cord, your nervous system. So we have very interesting adaptations in our body that got there because evolution. It was not necessarily a straight path, and it certainly is not an optimized path. It is just a working, functional path. So what evolution in life has given us is a bunch of working templates to start with, but they have not been made efficient or optimized. You should probably listen to Richard Dawkins talk about this. One of the great heathens, but actually a pretty good scientist and a great observer of things, and makes good theories that get tested, and lives at exactly that sort of a philosophical new sphere in science that people want to live at in philosophy through pure thought. But it's science that's taking us there. It's peeling away the layers of the onion of reality, seeing quantum effects at the very small, seeing relativistic effects at the very large, and trying to resolve the two with things like loop quantum gravity theory, and then making predictions based on that and sitting back and listening for the evidence. Our predictions say we should hear black holes exploding or something. Primordial black hole echoes and something like the background radiation that prove the Big Bang. There's things coming to us in the near future that will prove or fail to prove loop quantum gravity and replace the nonsense of super symmetrical string theory that has almost become a religion online with rock stars and stuff. And the scientists behind loop quantum gravity Rovolio. I wish their names rolled off my tongue more. Carlos. Well, I'll get these people's names because it's important. They're the unsung heroes. They are the Guido van Rossums of science, you see. Guido van Rossum took the good work of these earlier people who made the ABC programming language, a programming language before Python that was much like Python that Guido borrowed from and unified the unholy alliance of sysadmin type people, work that had to be done. People had to administrate systems, and so they had to write scripts in a scripting language. And the scripting languages they were using is usually Unix shell, also known as Bash shell, the Ash born-again shell, which was replaced by Perl in great part as the default lingua franca of tech because it got installed with Linux, and all the sysadmins picked it up and used it for automation, for system automation, deployment, before DevOps was a thing. There were lots of Perl scripts, and it was the P in the pool of tech. It's in and it ain't coming out. That was Perl, written by Larry Wall, the cunning linguist, the language professor of, inventing languages. So it borrowed from a lot of things, and there were a lot of inelegant kludges so that everyone's favorite form of expressiveness was wrapped into Perl, and it became the camel, the language of committee, and didn't scale well and collaborate well in a few different things. Object-orientedness came late, and in the meantime, Python stepped in to fill that void, being so syntax-light, having one true Pythonic way of doing things, although it might take Guido to tell you exactly what it is. An import system that is counterintuitive at first, but then is the best thing in the world. Variable scoping that's a little bit different than every other language, but once you get used to it, is really kind of nice. Duck typing that doesn't penalize you for unanticipated bugs as much as other duck type language, because if something has ambiguity, it throws an error. If it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. If what it's saying could be interpreted two ways, then don't let the person hear the quack, throw an error, and force them to not try and do operators between integers and strings that could be interpreted two ways. So force the string conversion to have to occur. But everyone hates, wrapping things in this str function. So allow f strings to come in from other languages and replace other nearly there formatting syntaxes like .fmt that work just well enough, but really are annoying in their own way, but gave you curly brackets. So keep the curly brackets, use the convention we also have of symbols going before the open quote, because we already have B for binary, R for raw, so throw in F for F strings and allow a nice little templating formatting system to exist, like a Jinja Junior, built right into Python as part of the main language. That's what F strings are. So a real yielding to pragmatism. Python allows itself to be bent and twisted in smart ways where there are not namespace syntax collisions. So list comprehensions could be brought in from other languages. And in such a way, Python grows. It grows from version 1 to 2 to 3 over a period of 30 years. Think about that. In 30 years, 3 versions of Python. And from 2 to 3, created an internal holy war because of the change of a couple of things that convert scripts too easily. And meanwhile, in the Node.js JavaScript world, what has that been on the scene for maybe 5 years? Node's a newcomer. The extraction of the V8 engine from Chrome, poured into a web server, going ta-da, about 5 years old, and they're on version 17, and breaks things in between each versions. Oh my God, can you believe it? So anyway, the use of tools is fundamental. No tool itself is fundamental because they're all derivative. The tools for programming are meta tools because they're tools for making tools. which elevates people like Guido van Rossum and the giants whose shoulders he stood on to enormous levels. These are the most skilled craftspeople and magicians and scientists of our age, because they're making durable tools that solve most problems for most people most of the time. And even when they become obsoleted, they won't die. Lisp won't die, because even though it wasn't the tech that won, even though it didn't become the P in the pool of tech like the C programming language did, because Unix is portable because it was written in C, and C is portable, port the language, port the portable operating system, and the apps come with it, just with one recompile. It's gotten much more elegant than that these days because of virtual hardware levels and wheel application installer, repo systems, repository systems. I've got a pre-compiled binary for whatever abstract hardware machine your actual hardware runs. So a lot of agreed upon standards, x86 platforms, ARM platforms, the way, the hardware works, the register system, the machine code, the assembly and assembler languages. So I'm going to have to wrap up here, but I think you got a really good idea of where I'm going with all this, because tools are really important, and languages are imperfect and full of nuance, and knowing the imperfections of the language and knowing the nuances of the language really matters. And you want to internalize one of these languages as how you talk to machine languages and let it come natural, like your spoken language of, you're born into culture and society, made of that come natural to you, so you can express yourself freely. And sometimes use the, tight ass, stick up your butt concepts of comp sci people that allows for scalability and interoperability and all these other things, but sometimes not being so uptight about it and keeping simple things simple, and using anti-patterns, really upsetting the comp sci people, letting them see you do things that's going to flip them out and make them angry at you. That stuff really happens. The adoption of Python itself causes that reaction in the traditional static compiled comp sci world and mentality. Now, thank goodness, the comp sci departments and the introduction to computers 101, comp sci 101, world round, has gotten their butts off of Lisp Scheme and Java. So first it was, Scheme, which is a dialect of the Lisp programming language. There's Common Lisp, but that's not so practical. Scheme is the slightly more practical dialect of the Lisp programming languages. Why dialects? Because Lisp is born to make languages. So you at least have to make one abstraction level of useful enough Lisp. So the standard that's out there is called Common Lisp, but it's not specific enough to solve people's everyday problems. That version is called Schema, or Clojure if you want it running on the Java virtual machine, but there's sub-stories here. So that's what comp sci departments taught for a long time, because MIT's influence, the Media Lab, MIT, an alternative to Unix/Linux world that almost was it, the Amiga of its time, the incompatible timeshare system ITS, the Lisp language, Lisp hardware. There's a whole grab bag of things that found its way into early graphics workstations, early things that we now know of as like CGI and SGI. The company was, SGI, Silicon Graphics, and they got wrapped up and bought into things. There was Cray supercomputers, thinking machines. There were so many things back in those days that had alternative approaches that were wacky and awesome, and then x86. Even x86 onto the Motorola 6800, 68000, PowerPC, Cell. There's a whole bunch of words that was used for one of the hanging on alternatives to x86. But then x86 thunked everything, and so there you got one of your agreed upon, virtual machine layers, some flavor of x86. So there's dialects of hardware and there's dialects of language, and you mix and match these things together to get something generic and timeless enough to suit your needs. And so in my case, that meant that the operating system is Linux, generic and timeless enough, but Unix will do. The language that I use there is Python, generic and timeless enough to suit my needs. It's the right tool. It's got the right abstractions and stuff. And then on top of that, the right editor to use is Vim. But in the short term, for people who can't make that steep learning curve transition, it is Jupyter Notebook. And then that brings us full circle, because the install of the standalone Jupyter Notebook right now is terrible. Terrible. It's a terrible install story. It's now based on Electron, but the update is not automatic and you have to do it, and it's a 500 megabyte download, and sometimes things go wrong that are not easy to fix, so you have to uninstall. And we got to fix that Jupyter Notebook standalone install story, then everything gets better for everyone in the world. And so that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for joining me. Hope to talk to you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.